It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sure the weather in Netanya is always this beautiful.
It is. We learned that today.
That's what I figured. Today's class, as you know, is in memory of Moshe Meir ben Avraham HaCohen veRivka Rachel, Zichrono Livracha. I'm very pleased that the colleagues that preceded me exceeded their time limits, so I don't feel pressured necessarily to complete everything in the allotted time. The title for today's talk, Jordan River is Deep and Wide, is actually a famous song. It's a spiritual which was first associated with freed slaves in America. It was first documented in the 19th century, in 1860, I think. I'm sure you all know it. It became a folk song. How does it go? Jordan River is deep and wide. Good. Why am I mentioning that? Yes, correct. It's all part of the same song. Why am I mentioning that? Because I think we'll discover that crossing the Ardennes was a transformative moment in our history as the Jewish people. And it became, obviously, an important idea for other peoples who also felt that they were making some sort of a transformative crossing, a journey. That's the power of the Tanach. Yes, of course, it's our story, but it speaks to much larger concerns. It speaks to the human condition. And in that very, very broad context, we're going to be examining a very specific moment, which is entering Eretz Yisrael. And I think that we will discover that the theme of transformation is absolutely essential to the process. Before we get to that, I feel like a larger frame is appropriate. That is to say, thinking of Sefer Yehoshua as part of something bigger. We're sometimes conditioned to think of biblical books as independent units, which of course they are. But at the same time, we realize, I think we even realized this morning from the Torah that we already learned, that there's an intense interconnectedness. There's no such thing as a biblical book or a biblical story, for that matter, that stands alone. It is always interconnected with other parts of the Tanakh. And that's a very, very special opportunity. If we were to consider the trajectory of the Torah as it ends, Moshe dies on Har Nevo, the people mourn him, but the goal of the process remains unrealized, which is to enter the land. That was the point. When Hashem first spoke to Moshe at the SNAC, Ra'o ra'iti et oni ami asher b'Mitzrayim, va'ered lahatzilo miyad Mitzrayim ulaha'aloto min ha'aretz hahi el eretz tova urechava el eretz zavat chalav udvash. That was the goal of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Not simply to leave Mitzrayim, but to enter the land. And that goal remained unrealized. Moshe died. The people mourned him. We might even say, going back to the story of Avraham Avinu and Sarah Imenu, that was the goal in that story as well. Lech lecha, el haaretz asher areke ve'escha legoy gadol, etc. So it's kind of curious in a way that the Torah ends the account not with the entry into the land, which is really its natural conclusion, but with Moshe's death. Obviously, there's a reason for that, because the Torah is associated with Moshe. Moshe, who speaks to Hashem panim el panim. And the Torah becomes the record of that encounter, and therefore holds a special place which no other biblical book can match. And yet, the connection is obvious. And Chazal expressed this connection very strongly. You have it in your source sheets. It's on page 4. We're making quick progress, aren't we? The Talmud in Baba Batra, which discusses authorship of the books of Tanach. Amar Mar Yehoshua katav sifro u'shmona psukim shebatorah. This is the prevailing view. The Torah is actually completed not by Moshe, who dies, vayamot sham Moshe eved Hashem, but by his loyal protege Yehoshua, who writes the final 8 psukim. And this is in fact the view of Rabbi Yehuda. I'm skipping a little bit. Ad kan katav Moshe, mikan ve'elach katav Yehoshua, divrei Rabbi Yehuda, va'amri le Rabbi Nehemiah. Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, indeed, Yehoshua writes the final psukim. Perhaps it's Rabbi Nehemiah who says that. It couldn't be that Moshe died and continued writing. Well, lots of authors are producing posthumous works these days, but the rabbis couldn't imagine such a thing. If Moshe died, that was the end of the story. So who completed the Torah? Yehoshua writes the final 8 psukim. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, Efshar Sefer Torah chaser ot achat, uchtiv lakoach et Sefer HaTorah hazeh. Could it be that the Torah lacks one letter that Moshe didn't write? It wouldn't be complete. Ela adkan hakadosh baruch hu omer u'Moshe omer vekotev mikan ve'elach hakadosh baruch hu omer u'Moshe kotev b'dema. A poignant image. Moshe does complete the Torah according to Rabbi Yosei. Moshe records the events surrounding his death as the tears are flowing. He's writing it b'dema, in tears. God dictates and Moshe writes, just like the rest of the Torah. Rabbi Yosei is not willing to compromise with the Mosaic authorship doctrine, even for one letter. By the way, the Gra has a fantastic interpretation. He says, dema doesn't mean tears here. In agricultural law, something which is damua means a mixture. It's a mixture of truma and chulin. And one has to deal with it the way one deals with it, because only a Kohen can eat truma, and a regular Israelite cannot. But it means a mixture. And the Gra explains, what does it mean that Moshe writes bidema? He writes those final letters, but they're all jumbled. He doesn't actually know what it says when he writes the final psukim. It's only later, after his death, that they'll be rearranged to tell the story that we actually read, Vayamot Sham Moshe. But it's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that I'd like to focus on, because it sets up a very clear connection. The Torah and Sefer Yehoshua are part of the same story, in a way that perhaps other biblical books are not as cohesively connected. And that is the prevailing view, that Yehoshua writes the final 8 psukim. That is to say, the linkage between the end of the Torah and the beginning of the next story, called that Sefer Yehoshua, is a linkage which is cohesive. These two things cannot be taken apart. I want to briefly explore Sefer Yehoshua. It's long. It's 24 chapters. We're not going to get through them all. But I'd like to break it down into units. And that's easy, actually, because it lends itself to literary units. And the first is the first 5 chapters. That's going to be our focus this morning, with special emphasis on chapters 3 and 4, crossing the Yarden. The first 5 chapters, the first unit, I'm going to call it the connective material. On the one hand, it's a new chapter in Israelite history. On the other hand, it's very much rooted in the events of the Torah, and many things that happen in the first 5 chapters of Sefer Yehoshua evoke memories of events that happened earlier, which is natural because it's a story of succession. That's one of the primary themes. Yehoshua is Moshe's successor, with everything that implies. Whenever we have a succession story, there will be a natural tendency to reflect upon the events of the past and how they will inform the future. That's the first 5 chapters. I might say already, we know it intrinsically and intuitively. If I speak of the crossing of the Yarden, that immediately evokes a memory. It's not my idea, it's Sefer Tehillim's idea. It's not Sefer Tehillim's idea, it's Yehoshua's idea. What's the memory which is evoked with the crossing of the Yarden? Kriyat Yam Suf. Hayam ra'av hayanos hayarden yisov le'achor. That's the Tehillim version. Yehoshua will say it explicitly in Perek Daled, Perek Hey. That's the kind of material that the first 5 chapters is about. Yehoshua spies, Moshe spies. People enter the land, they do circumcision, they celebrate the Passover. That reminds us of the circumcision and the Passover on the eve of the Exodus. So these first 5 chapters are all about reminding us, evoking the earlier moments in the saga of the Exodus, but with a particular twist. It's not simply a reminder of the earlier events, but their redemption, as we will see. Because very often, the earlier events ended in setback or in failure, and it is the job of Sefer Yehoshua and Yehoshua to revisit those moments and to redeem them in order to embrace the future. Because that's what we have to do. We can't forget the past, the failures of the past. Our job is to look at those failures and to take them and to reflect on them and to redeem them so that we can go forward. Chapter 5 ends with a visit from a malach. Yehoshua and the people are located on the outskirts of Yericho, and there is a Sar Tzava Hashem with an outstretched sword that confronts Yehoshua. Yehoshua says, Halanu ata im letzarenu, whose side are you on? And the mysterious figure answers, Ani Sar Tzava Hashem ata bati. Shal na'alcha me'al raglecha, ki hamakom asher ata omed alav kodeshu. You can't be more explicit than that. What does that recall? The beginning of Moshe's mission. The SNAC. Moshe sees the malach, belabadesh mitoch hasneh, and God tells him precisely that. It's almost verbatim. Really what I'm saying is Yehoshua's mission, his new mission, only begins after these 5 chapters have already taken place. What is the new mission? The conquest of the land. And that's the next unit. Chapter 6 through chapter 12. We're not going to go into all the details. conquest of Yericho, the conquest of the Ai, the conquest of the southern coalition, the conquest of the northern coalition, the list of the defeated kings, Perek Yud Bet. Perek Yud Gimel, chapter 13, through chapter 22, roughly, is the story not of the conquest, but of the distribution of the land. Which tribe gets what? Tribe of Yehudah, the tribes of Yosef, the other tribes, the cities of refuge, the Leviim, all of that stuff unresolved in the Torah, but already spoken of at the end of Sefer Bimidbar. And finally, chapters 23 and 24, Yehoshua's last addresses. What's Yehoshua's last address? Timnat Serach in Mount Ephraim, that's where he dies. That's a joke. The last addresses that he offers to the people on the eve of his death. Those are the final chapters of the book. Very much like Sefer Devarim concluding with Moshe's final addresses to the people of Israel. So there's an intense parallel between Sefer Yehoshua and the Torah, especially Sefer Devarim. There's a cohesive connection between the Torah, the story of Moshe, as it were, if we were to look at it through the lens of a single protagonist, and Sefer Yehoshua. And at the same time, it is not simply a repeat of those earlier events, but a transformation of them. Yehoshua begins his story with an overwhelming challenge. Who could possibly succeed Moshe? Asher yida'o Hashem panim el panim. How do I know that it's an overwhelming challenge? Because the first chapter introduces a phrase which will be repeated 4 times. God will say it 3 times to Yehoshua. The tribes will say it to Yehoshua. The 2.5 tribes will say it to Yehoshua once. What is that phrase? Chazak ve'ematz. If somebody is told 4 times Chazak ve'ematz, that indicates they have a lot to be worried about. They have a challenge which is overwhelming. Chazak ve'ematz, chazak ve'ematz, chazak ve'ematz, from God, from the people. It's actually not the first time that Yehoshua hears chazak ve'ematz. He hears it in Parshat Vayelech. Vayikra Moshe Yehoshua. Vayomer elav le'enei chol Yisrael chazak ve'ematz. And it happens later in Parshat Vayelech. Chazak ve'ematz. 6 times. The phrase only occurs like 11 times in all of Tanach. Yehoshua has more than half. But by the way, we know this phrase from another context, the David Hashem Ori V'Yish'i, which is also a psalm about overcoming challenge. How does it end? Kave'el Hashem chazak v'yametz libecha v'kave'el Hashem. That is the trumpet call for facing challenge. Chazak ve'ematz. Yehoshua's first act. You know, it used to be back in the day, a student can say, I forgot my book at home. But we can't say that anymore because we all have a handheld device. So if you don't have a Tanakh, you may want to look at Yehoshua Perek Aleph. I particularly like the alhatorah.org site. I'm not being paid to say that. I just find it very useful. Or you can have a physical book. Anyways, Yehoshua's first act as new leader, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud, Vayitzav Yehoshua et shotrei ha'am lemor. He commands the officers of the people. And what does he command them? Pass through the camp. Vitzavu et ha'am lemor. Tell the people, hachinu lachem tzeidah. Prepare provisions. Ki ba'od shloshet yamim atem ovrim et hayarden hazeh. 3 days' time you will cross over this Yarden. Lavo lareshet et haaretz, in order to enter the land and possess it, the land which God gives you to possess. I'd like to suggest that in these few psukim, at the very beginning of the book, after the clarion call of Chazak ve'ematz, is encapsulated everything that we need to know about Sefer Yehoshua. Vayitzav Yehoshua et shotrei ha'am lemor. The first thing that this man does as the new leader is to utter a command to the people through the officers. What does that indicate? The transition will be smooth. In fact, it will be seamless. There is a plan. It has been thought out. The stability is already here in this command. There is a chain of command which you can depend upon. And most importantly, the very first command is to the people, Hachinu lachem tzeidah. Got to make those peanut butter sandwiches, because we're crossing the Yarden in 3 days' time. It's one of those moments where a little word triggers a memory. I'm sure we all have this occasionally. Someone says something, maybe even off the cuff, and wow, that reminds me of. Hachinu lachem tzeidah. Tzeidah is not an unprecedented word in the Tanach, but it is unusual. Prepare tzeidah. Does that remind us of anything? Vayofu et habatzek asher hotziu mi Mitzrayim ugot matzot kilo chametz ki gorshu mi Mitzrayim velo yachlu lehitmamea v'gam tzeidah lo asu lahem. Which is hard to believe, because they knew they were leaving. Or did they? Maybe they didn't believe it. Maybe it was unbelievable, and it was unbelievable. But Bnei Yisrael were caught unprepared, and the matzah industry was born. Okay? Yehoshua's first command is obviously about preparing, but it's also about remembering. This is going to be different than Yetziat Mitzrayim. And it is. Because we know the plan. And I'm spelling it out for you, says Yehoshua. Sefer Yehoshua never presents us, with one exception, which is quickly resolved, it never presents us with a nasty surprise. The narratives of Sefer Shmot and Sefer Bimidbar are full of nasty surprises. We're caught unawares. No water, no food, no destination, no leader we can depend on. And Moshe's leadership, by and large, is reactive. He has to react in the moment to the challenge that arises unexpectedly. Sefer Yehoshua is something else entirely. Everything is spelled out in triplicate, just so we know exactly what's expected. So prepare ahead of time, because we're crossing the Yarden. And you've got 3 days to do it. And of course, I don't have to tell you a 3-day motif is something that comes up in Tanach in many places, such as Har Sinai, Ba'od Shloshet Yamim. What else? 3 days. Right, that was the demand to leave Egypt for 3 days to serve Hashem. the Akedah, Bayom HaShelishi, Vayisa Avraham et Einav. Esther making her plea to the king, V'tsumu alai va'al tochlu v'al tishtu shloshet yamim, Vayhi Bayom HaShelishi, V'tilbash Esther malchut, etc. So sometimes what awaits us at the end of the 3 days is frightening. And sometimes what awaits us at the end of the 3 days is welcoming. But the 3 days is about anticipating it. Not being caught off guard. What time do I have until? Just what? 3 days? What? 3 days? 12:30, my goodness. Is that with the extra time or without?
With the extra.
Oh boy, okay. All righty, let's go on. Basically, we sort of got to the point, so to speak. Sefer Yehoshua makes it clear from the get-go what this is going to be about. It's going to be about remembering. It's going to be about evoking. It's going to be about revisiting, and I'm talking about particularly the first 5 chapters. And it's going to be about overcoming. And so it goes. Chapter 2, no time. Yehoshua spies. Okay, page 5 in your handout. The quick rundown. Yehoshua spies versus Chet HaMeraglim. See for yourself. Whatever, I'm not going to get into the Sefer Devarim version of Chet HaMeraglim versus the Parshat Shlach version. That's a separate discussion. Let's just call it God's command versus Yehoshua's initiative. And that's awfully important, because Sefer Yehoshua is about initiative. 12 spies versus 2. Leaders of the people versus anonymous men. We'll never find out who those spies were in Sefer Yehoshua. A lengthy, detailed mission versus a short, general mission. A public send-off. This was the great mistake. Public send-off of those 12 public men versus a secret dispatch. And in spite of the fact that Moshe's spies traversed the land with no threats reported whatsoever, they came back with a damning report. In spite of the fact that Yehoshua's spies were almost captured and killed, they came back with a glowing report. How can that be? A frightened diagnosis of defeat versus a confident verdict of victory, for those that like alliterations. Failure versus success. That's the point. There's a transformation which happened. It took a generation to achieve, but it happened. The spies who were mighty men in Parshat Shlach turned out to be afraid of their shadows. Who could blame them? They had to face the giants. Rambam says, it's a beautiful piece in the Moreh Nevuchim. We can't discuss the context now. It's not really conceivable for a slave to wash the clay off their hands and go and fight the giants. That was the demand, so to speak, of Parshat Shlach, but it was impossible. And therefore, these spies in Sefer B'Midbar and its aftermath is not God who is punitive, but God the pedagogue, so to speak. Not God who's punishing the people for falling prey to the report of the spies, but God who is indicating and informing them that it will take a generation of careful work in order for them to be ready. And Sefer Yehoshua is that story of the people now ready to undertake the mission that their parents were incapable of doing. And I'm not blaming anybody, because it was an impossible mission when the people left Mitzrayim. So again, a memory, and don't forget, of course, Yehoshua was one of those men. If anybody remembered the episode of the spies, it was him. He didn't make the same mistakes. That's the point. And the people were not the same people. That's the point. And so to revisit that debacle, which had been so tragic, and to redeem it. to relive it, as it were, in some sort of a transformed fashion. And all of this brings us to crossing the Yarden, because now we're ready, actually. The spies returned. The chronology is a little off. I'm not going to get into that now. But the spies returned, and now the people prepare to cross. And I'm in chapter 3. Yehoshua gets up early in the morning. He is an early riser, like Avraham Avinu. And they traveled from the Shittim. I'm in chapter 3, verse 1. You don't have it in front of you. You have to know this from memory or a Tanach, right? They traveled to the Yarden. The 3 days have passed. They're going now. This is it. We're on our way. Hu v'chol b'nei Yisrael. Vayalinu sham terem ya'avoru. Everybody, I want us to get a good night's sleep. We're going to sleep over and do this in the morning. What I might have expected is all this anticipation. 3 days, we're on our way. And then to get to the Yarden, Yeshua says, not so fast. We're sleeping over. We'll do it in the morning. I'll get back to you in the morning.
The hotel wasn't ready yet. The hotel wasn't ready yet on the other.
Could be. It's a strange moment. Unless we have a memory, another memory that informs the story. Well, I won't tell you what it is yet. Okay? It could be many moments, that's the truth. Because so many of them were anxious and panicked. But there's one in particular that I'm thinking of. The people are commanded with the following command: when you see the Ark of the Covenant, you follow it. That's how we're going to cross this river. Don't get too close. Keep your distance, but follow the Aron. I'll just point out that according to the protocol in Parshat B'Midbar, that's never how the people of Israel travel. How do they travel? The Aron is betoch hamachanot. The ark travels between, in the middle, embraced by the people of Israel. With one glaring exception, which you all know. What is it? Moshe turns to Chovav in Parshat Bahalotcha. What does he say? Nosim anachnu el hamakom asher amar Hashem. We're on our way, Chovav. Are you joining us? Chovav says, you know what? I'm heading home. Moshe says, please, v'hayita lanu le'inayim. The goodness that God will bestow on us will be bestowed on you as well. Vayisu mehar Hashem derech shloshet yamim. Va'aron brit Hashem nosea lifnehem derech shloshet yamim latur lahem menucha. The only other time where the ark travels ahead and there's a 3-day motif once again is what? The first attempt to journey to the land. How did that attempt end? Failure. Vayihi ha'am kemit onanim, v'ha'asafsuf asher b'kirbo hitavu ta'ava. Eventually the miraglim, before you know it, game over. That generation is not entering the land. The first journey to the land led by the ark was aborted. And the people never made it. So you tell me. Yehoshua says, ark goes in front, follow it. What are those kids who now grew up into the next generation going to remember? That journey. But this journey is going to be different. Just follow the ark, because this time will be different. And so they did. And they got to the edge of the Yarden. The Yarden was overflowing. It's hard to imagine for us, I know. Okay, I'll just point out, we learn later another connection. The day, it says explicitly in Sefer Yehoshua, the day of crossing the Yarden was the 10th day of the first month. What's the 10th day in the first month in the collective memory? taking the sheep for Korban Pesach. Be'asor lachodesh hazeh, v'yikchu lahem ish sela veit avot sela bait. Because what we're doing in this moment of crossing the Yarden is remembering the events of the Exodus and its aftermath, and revisiting and reflecting and redeeming. And so they get to the edge of the river, and what happens? It's, well, splits, I guess. It cuts off, right? Flows backwards, perhaps. Hayarden tisov le'achor. What would we have expected? Ark in front, follow the ark, follow the ark. What's the expectation? The ark will go first. What happens? Counterintuitively, at first glance, the ark remains behind. The people go first. What on earth is that about? It's about initiative. This is a new generation with a new challenge. Dor Hamidbar was about following. Follow the Anan and follow the Aron. And that's the best you can do, for goodness sake. Because what else can a slave do who's newly liberated? Just follow the orders. Here the ark stops at the edge of the Yarden, and the people go before it. Into the land. It is a, how shall I put it, transcendent moment. I'll just point out, again, a cue perhaps, Vayihi bin Soa ha'aron vayomer Moshe, is replaced in chapter 3 of Sefer Yehoshua with Vayihi bin Soa ha'am, to make their way to the river. That's the essence of the transformation. To take that initiative. It's not about forgetting God. It's about having that confidence that God bestows to go forward and take that step. And sure enough, the people passed over. Vayimaharu ha'am vaya'avoru. Vayimaharu ha'am. They quickly passed over, they quickly crossed over and made their way into the land. What does that remind us of? I quoted it before. It wasn't exactly the same words, but certainly the same sentiment. They baked matzot. Why? Ki gorshu mitzrayim, velo yachlu lehitmamea. They were rushed out. There's an element of speed in both stories, but how different it is. My wife has a joke. She likes to run the Jerusalem Marathon. Not the whole thing, but she does pretty good. She does the half marathon. She does a 10-kilometer run, whatever. And she says, it is so exhilarating. Why? The first time in Jewish history, you've got 30,000 Jews running, and nobody's chasing them. So I would say it's actually the second time in Jewish history. The first time in Jewish history where Jews are running and no one is chasing them is Vayimaharu ha'am vaya'avoru. The people hurried into the land. That's a hurriedness which is activated by anticipation and desire to get to the destination. It's everything that Yetziat Mitzrayim was not. And of course, when we reflect on the ultimate parallel between Kriyat Yam Suf and Kritat HaYarden, that becomes obvious. So I'll just return us to that story for a moment. You all know it. Perek Yud Daled of Sefer Shmot. Vayisu v'nei Yisrael et eineihem, v'hinei Mitzrayim nosea achareihem. There they are, camped out on Yam Suf. They break out the beach towels, the picnics, whatever. Just be careful when you go in the water. Keep an eye on you. And all of a sudden, I think this is one moment, maybe the only one that Hollywood actually captures. They see that little wisp of smoke, what looks like smoke on the horizon, but it's getting closer. And it suddenly sounds like thunder or something like that. And they realize that the Egyptian charioteers are bearing down. And now they realize that actually they have been trapped by this divine maneuver. Vayitzaku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem. Vayomaru el Moshe hamibli ein kivarim b'Mitzrayim lekachtanu lamut b'midbar mazot asita lanu lohotzianu miMitzrayim. Such a pathetic moment. You brought us here to die. Moshe says, don't worry, it's all going to be okay. God will take care of it. Does Moshe know what's going to happen? I would respectfully suggest that he does not. Because the very next thing we hear is, Ma titzak elai. God turns to Moshe, which is the indicator that Moshe is praying for guidance. Here's the guidance. Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yisa'u. V'yisa'u where? V'taharem et matcha u'nte'et yadcha al hayam uv'ka'ehu, etc. The people will go through. By the way, Chazal tell us, it seems to be implied, Leil shivi'i yardu layam. So imagine this scene, if you will. Darkness is falling. The Egyptians are bearing down. The sea splits. But it's not exactly a calm moment, because they know the Egyptians are in pursuit. That's part of the plan, after all, that the Egyptians enter into the sea as well. And by the way, even though the Midrash will turn it into a visit to the aquarium, it's actually a little bit more frightening. I would respectfully suggest, when the Torah says, Vahamayim lahem choma mi minam umismolam, and we like to sing it with buoyancy, if that's the right word for the context. And yet, what does it actually indicate? To enter Yam Suf is to enter a tunnel. There is water to the right and there is water to the left, and there are Egyptians in pursuit, and there's actually only one way to go, which is forward. That's the good news. The bad news is it is a harrowing journey. I don't know how many of you are from New York. I'm not, but I lived in Washington Heights for a year. That tunnel at the 181st Street station, that's what I think of, okay? That's like Kriyat Yam Suf. Shoving and pushing and panicking in a narrow passage, and Egyptians in pursuit and darkness. Yes, there's the Amud Ha'esh, whatever. I know which way to go, but that's all I know. That's what it felt like. And what about crossing the Yarden? So the text reports something absolutely fascinating. To notice it is to appreciate the fundamental difference between these two experiences. The text reports the following. I'm in chapter 3, verse 16. Vaya'amdu hamayim hayordim milmala. I didn't call the Yarden for nothing. The waters descending, right, Laredet, the waters descending were stopped up and dammed. Kamu ned echad. A single wall. Ned, of course, recalls Shirat Hayam. Kafuta Hamot. What's the pasuk there about the Ned? Whatever, you'll look it up. Ned Nozlim. Good, thank you. Okay? A single wall. Harchek me'od, but very far away. Me Adam Ha'ir. From the city Adam. Now, we don't know exactly where Adam is, but there's speculation that it's related to the Arab town today called Adamiyah. And often Arab towns preserve very ancient names. Adamiyah is about 25 kilometers north of Jericho. The people crossed at Jericho. What does that mean? They don't cross through a narrow strait. They cross across a front. That's the real meaning, I assume. So one of you said it before. Hayarden tisov la'achor. The Yarden turns back. The Yarden backs up. The gates of the land are flung open. And the people go. They enter across a front. 25 kilometers long. There's no pushing, there's no shoving, there's no rushing, except the rush of anticipation. So to remember that event, to reflect upon it, and to merit to live its transformation. That's the story of crossing the Yarden. Ad ya'avor amcha Hashem. Ad ya'avor amzu kanita. Did they know what they were singing? I don't know. Chazal understood it to mean Ad ya'avor means crossing Yam Suf. Ad ya'avor amzu kanita means returning to the land under Ezra. What's the pshat? Well, the pshat is it's a poem. Poems are repetitive, no? Ana Hashem ani avdecha, ani avdecha ben amatecha. That's a pshat, but no, you're right. There's an illusion in here. Maybe it's closer to the surface than we can think. The people realize it's only the beginning of the journey leaving Mitzrayim, but they have no idea what it actually means. There's another crossing they'll have to make that will be, as it were, intrinsically connected to this one, and that will be crossing the Yarden. And so the point I'd like to make, when all is said and done, is that to understand the gift of revisiting the past is to be able to transform it and face the future. And that's the essential idea of crossing the Yarden, even as we remember, not so fondly, the crossing of Yam Suf. All of this is summarized for you on page 6 of your sources. And just very quickly, one more minute, 30 seconds, okay? The essence of the Exodus narrative versus the essence of the Knisa La'aretz narrative. Hasty and unanticipated, that's Yetziat Mitzrayim, caught unawares, unprepared. Planned and plotting, entering the land. A route which is diverted. The people actually go back to get to Yam Suf versus some sort of a destination which is dependably spelled out and guided. Enemy pursuit and Israelite outcry versus embrace of destiny and Israelite calm. Moshe's spontaneous reaction versus Yehoshua's deliberateness, etc. Panicked objects versus confident subjects. I would like to suggest that all of this perhaps answers a question which maybe none of you asked, but we should ask it. Kriyat Yam Suf was a transcendent moment in its own right. How did we mark it? As a people, we sang Shirat Hayam. So tell me, where is Shirat Hayarden? Ashira Lashem ki ga'o ga'a, Nahar umeimav heishiv achor. Where is Shirat Hayarden? I think the answer is, it's not that they're too busy, it's that biblical Shira on an epic scale takes place when I feel that my life is hanging in the balance and there's a divine intervention which preserves me from harm. That's Kriyat Yam Suf. That's not Kritat HaYarden. There never was a moment in the Knisa La'aretz where the people felt that their lives were hanging in the balance. Because that's the essence of what it is to enter the land. To enter the land as confident subjects, with a divine assurance, with an embrace of the future. That's Kritat HaYarden. Thank you.